Thank you for coming. I'm here today to talk about identity governance and administration, or the least exciting and most effective way to secure your corporate assets. My name is Paula Burke, and I am a lead platform engineer at Stitch Fix currently, where I build cloud infrastructure. My work is aimed at improving reliability, resilience, and systems in our human and computer systems. So that basically means that my job is to automate all of the things and to be a good partner to other teams, particularly IT and our engineering people. Before I was a software engineer, I actually worked in book publishing and at a bunch of bookstores. So this is a second career for me, and I have about a little more than 5 years of experience as a software engineer. One of the reasons that I really like software engineering and security in particular is because it asks us to look at all of the ways that systems interact with one another, the responsibilities that we have over them, and the ways that they can fail us. So what is this talk, and why am I here, and why am I telling you that what I'm going to talk about is boring to most people? So the thing that I'm going to talk about today is called identity governance and administration. Some of the things I'm going to cover at the beginning of the talk are to get us all on the same page. That includes things like terminologies that you'll hear, some of the key concepts and tools that you will read about or hear about, the security and regulatory risks that are involved with poor identity governance and administration, and some ways that companies, both enterprise and small, can mitigate the risks associated with these. Why do I care about identity in particular and how to deal with it at an enterprise level? It's because I believe that this is a really hard problem space. I think that it's very easy to look at what IT does and what HR does and say, like, well, you'll just automate it, right? Like, how do employees have access that they shouldn't have when we have all of these vendors and all of these systems that are supposed to take care of us for us? What are we paying IT for? I don't understand how this went wrong. I think that appreciating the difficulty of solving some of the associated problems by understanding them at a really granular level is important. And then one of the other reasons that I think that this matters a lot is because solving this well delivers enormous business value. If you look at all of the hardest problems that the people who run security and infrastructure and IT at any given company, they'll tell you that they would pay a lot of money to have this solved for them, either to a vendor or to an employee. It might as well be you. So when you're looking at jobs and careers and security, this is something that governance, risk, and compliance is a great area as you're transitioning into a technical role. In particular, because the values that make people good at this kind of role are things like empathy, being able to talk to people from different departments, a level of meticulousness, and need to get things right, and attention to detail. And that's all things that I care about and skills that I have, and I like having a place that I can aim them. And what are you going to learn in the talk today? We're going to learn how to test some of your systems that handle identity and access at any given company. I'm going to talk through how you can use a tabletop exercise to test some of those systems, and we'll walk through one together. So let's start. If you're not familiar with some of these concepts, we should define what is identity governance and administration. Throughout this talk, I'm going to call it IGA, just so I don't have to say the word identity 3,000 times. And how is, like, there are a bunch of associated concepts too. And so defining what identity governance or an administration is in contrast to identity access management or privileged access management or any number of three-letter words that get thrown around in this space, it's kind of difficult. Like, the lines between these things are very fuzzy, and a lot of them are defined by vendors who have this word salad that's there to sell you on things. So I ended up having to come up with my own definition of identity governance and administration. And in this case, I think it refers to the automated systems and repeatable workflows that enforce identity and access management policies. So when I say that, it means that the focus here is in two places. It's one, that we are dealing with identity problems in an like in an enterprise or employer or at a large employer, and automating systems that handle identity across that organization. And the other part of it is that this is a big part of identity and access management in general. And this is just one way of handling it, or one aspect of it. So if you're not familiar with it, identity and access management is essentially getting the right people, the right access to the right resources at the right time. It's really as simple as that. There are lots of different aspects of this, both from a policy perspective and from a technical perspective. But this is the goal of all of those policies. Another associated concept that's important here is privileged access management. So it's very similar to identity management across an organization, like who an employee is and what they have access to. But there are specific systems at large organizations that manage accounts for users with elevated permissions to critical access, to critical assets. So at any given organization, you'll have some people who have the keys to the kingdom, and their credentials need to be handled slightly differently. So we're not really going to talk about that today, and we're not going to talk about broader identity and access management theories, although we'll mention a lot of them in this talk. So with IGA in particular, there are a couple of key components to this. I have a picture of raccoons in a trash bin. There are two big themes to the images that I'll use in this talk. One is animals that cause chaos, and the other is trash. The employees are the raccoons, and the trash is your corporate assets. So one of the key targets of identity governance and administration is provisioning and deprovisioning. So what access does an employee get when they begin a role? And when they leave the organization, are they deprovisioned? That means, do they lose access to things, and is their account locked? And make sure, there's two parts of this. Like, does the employee's account have access to resources in the organization, and does the employee have access to the account? So provisioning and deprovisioning need to remove access for that account to critical things, and then it needs to remove or allow access of the employer or not employee to the account itself. So identity governance and administration tools will often automate parts of that. They will take a workflow from an identity provider of some kind. This might be something like Workday or some HR specific thing, or just a list of employees. And that is fed, and the information about the employee and their employee status is fed downstream into other systems. And they will respond by provisioning or deprovisioning the employee with access based on a couple of different concepts, depending on how it's configured. The first one is role management, or something that you'll hear called RBAC. This is role-based access control. So role-based management is a pretty easy concept to understand. So this is like, if you take me, for example, at my job, I'm under the engineering organization. So I have the engineer role. That means that any permissions that are assigned to the engineer role are ones that I have. If I were to no longer be an engineer and instead worked in HR, then my role would be HR associate and it would not be engineer. So that is like an umbrella definition or a group that you belong to, and that you're assigned permissions based on that group. The other concept here is attribute management, or attribute-based access control. So it's similar to role-based, but it's a little bit different. So rather than saying like, you as an individual belong to this larger group and should have the permissions associated with this group, this is where you're given permissions based on some part of your identity. So most of the time, when you have a set of information about an employee in a system, it includes things like their name, their email address, their department, their manager, their whether they're a manager themselves or not, their title, maybe their level, their location, all kinds of things. So you can say that if an employee is in this particular department, they might have access to things. If they are a manager or not a manager, they might have access to certain things. And so that's one other way to define permissions within a system. And then based on those things, you can build integrations and automations across systems. So you can say that if a person is a manager and they're a member of the engineering organization, they should have access to this set of of systems. And if they're not, they should not. And if something in that if something about their role or their attributes changes, then your automated system will hopefully respond to that by either adding or removing or revising those permissions. So another big part of these kinds of workflows are integrations. So most companies don't build all their own internal software. Employees have a million different things to log into. If you're on the engineering or the infrastructure side, some of those are really critical, like AWS or Circle CI or GitLab or GitHub, any number of vendor systems that are critical to your the functioning of the company. They also include things that are just employee-based, like Workday or benefits management or Slack, things that everybody has. So most of those systems are enterprise grade and have set up so that you can integrate with your identity systems all the way across it. While they all like to make it seem that it's very easy to set up, SAML and SSO can be really complicated. This is usually managed by your IT team, but depending on how things are organized, it might also be infrastructure. So another big part of this is event logging. So when somebody logs into something, we know who did it, where, how long they were there, what they did while they were there. And for auditing purposes, we need to know about these things. Another concept here is just a workflow. So this isn't necessarily a technical thing, but it's something that you might have documented in runbooks, or you might have it automated depending where you are. It's to say, like, perhaps an employee is going to be offboarded. That means that IT knows that their account needs to be shut off at a particular time. They need to be manually removed from something. You might need to rotate a password manually in some other system. So workflows are or runbooks are like defined processes that manage some of your governance. So you also have analytics. Some more advanced systems can tell you track information about trends in access, where people are coming from, what they tend to do if they haven't logged into something in a long time. And you can make more informed decisions about what kind of access people can have based on those. Other sort of common concepts you'll hear, SSO or single sign-on. These are vendor tools usually that IT can use to consolidate logins, that use SAML and zero trust concepts to manage identity and access management in an automated way often. MFA or multi-factor authentication is also part of this. And privileged access management, as I mentioned earlier, is a component of this, but it's not sort of the primary thing. So those are a bunch of words that you will hear about a lot. And if you mention them to people in compliance, they will think that you know what you're talking about. So some of the key people involved in this include a number of departments and some that you might not expect. So most of the time we think of this as an IT task, but it's not limited to IT. It also involves HR, because HR defines who employees are, what information they should have access to. They're the one who controls what department people are in and all of the systems that trickle downstream. They're the one who knows when somebody's getting fired or that somebody's start date has changed or whatever. They are actually really critical people in managing employee life cycles, because they're the ones that hold all of the important information, and they're the ones who need to make sure that it gets to the right people, and that employee information is kept private, but that the right people have what they need to execute, business processes. Then you also have ops, which I just included as ops because that can be any number of infrastructure-related departments depending on your organization. Legal, who will come to you, or finance, who will come to you with compliance-related tasks, asking to prove that certain aspects of identity governance or administration have been performed and logged appropriately. Obviously, security, and often engineering. So as you're building out integrations between things, you'll need these folks as well. So what are some of the risks associated with poor employee lifecycle management? Like I said, it's really easy to be dismissive and say, like, yeah, we should just automate all of these things and take care of it. But and I don't know how it could ever possibly go wrong when it's so easy. But despite the fact that we have all of these tools at our disposal and that we know this is a huge risk, 80% of hacking-related breaches leverage compromised credentials. So employees that so it's really important that you don't have overprivileged employee identity accounts. So people should have a principle of least privilege. Like when you log in, you should only have access to the things that you absolutely need access to, and your identity should generally be protected so that you can't be phished so that people don't make assumptions about what kind of access you have based on public information, so that people don't have enough information about the internals of your company that they can social engineer you into giving away your keys, which might be really important if you're in infrastructure or IT or something similar. And we know what the risks of these things are. And I'm going to pick on Twitter here because their employee credentials have caused a number of large and public incidents over the last couple of years. Both of them fairly recently. One of them in which employees were social engineered out of their credentials by faking problems with a VPN. The other one that I thought was interesting was a little while ago, but one of their employees on their last day was able to delete Donald Trump's account. So this tells you exactly that, like, one, in the first case, protecting employee information and keeping them safe from having their credentials compromised, and then protecting them in a number of different layers through MFA and limited access to things. That's really important. And then on the other hand, cutting off access at an appropriate time is also important. Making sure that customer service employees can't have large material impacts on the business is probably important. So these considerations mean a lot, and they're going to make the news if you get them wrong. So some of the other risks beyond the sort of, I guess, obvious ones, like you don't want a data breach that's caused by employees' credentials being leaked or data being leaked because it's mishandled, or any of the sort of obvious incidents that we've seen here. There are also governance risks. So much of the stuff that I'm talking about today is governed by Sarbanes-Oxley, which is commonly referred to as SOX. It's a set of rules and regulations that protect investors from fraudulent accounting. This has asked corporations to be really good at financial disclosure, which means essentially that everything that impacts financial reporting has to be traced and documented, including the software that manages it. So if you're automating any of these processes, then you need to account for how they operate. You may need to give code snippets or explanations to auditors about how they function, how they enforce the controls that have been set out. You'll also need to prove that if you have elevated privileges that you haven't altered the logs that say who has accessed what or who's made changes to this. And so this is why like pull requests need to be reviewed, for example. It's why managers routinely perform audits of access, particularly to privileged environments. And it's why we have to implement things like locks on logs so that they can be verified. And it becomes quite complicated. So some of the other controls are, access rights, segregation of duties. People shouldn't have access to all of the things. We have audits, and to the extent possible, have automated reporting. So this can take up hours and hours of someone's time. And so part of, like, we've talked a lot about governing people's access to things, but the actual auditing process is a very heavy lift and requires a lot of time and resources from the organization. You really don't want to have engineers spending time digging for logs if you can help it. So the more that you can automate this and make sure that it's just kind of done and easy for the right people to access, the more time you're going to have to do other more interesting things. So what are some common IGA tools and strategies? You've heard me say automation frequently, and really, we're here to automate all of the things. So one of the things that we can automate is employee lifecycle management. And here is where, when I mentioned earlier that this is really complicated, that it's harder to understand, that it's easy to mess up. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's easy to mess up because sometimes the data that you have is bad. It's easy to mess up because things might happen with an employee over the course of their employment that don't make sense to you. And people make mistakes all across it. So managing an employee life cycle and understanding the ways that it can go wrong is really important. The first step of that is the source of the employee identity. So the stream of information that you're getting when you automate things, it's probably coming from some sort of workforce management software, but not necessarily. That software may have critical information like the person's department or their manager, but depending on how your organization is structured, it might really just say like the cost center. Like it might just be engineering, and then half of the company is under engineering. So that doesn't really let you do very much good role-based access control because it's not very granular. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about what that person does on a day-to-day basis. If you try to do it by title, well, I don't know, titles don't really mean anything. Like I don't actually know what I don't really know what my title means, to be perfectly honest with you. Platform, what's a platform engineer? So how do you make decisions based on that? That's also not like a structured thing. Sometimes who you report to doesn't define what your team is on. So often we make assumptions about an organizational structure based on a reporting chain that sometimes has nothing to do with the work that people do or what they need access to. So when you think about the source of identity for this, like, does it include all of the information that you need to make decisions? And are there ways that you can structure the data at its source that make your job easier later? So if you can, and is it up to date, right? Like, do those changes come across as soon as they're effective? Do you know about them in advance? So this is where HR becomes a really important partner because they can help you understand how those systems can provide really good information about people's identities and when changes happen, what order they happen in, what some common exception cases can be. And that's one of the relationships that I really value. Actually, the alternative talk to this was just why you should hang out with IT and HR more often. Because really, like, working with these teams that define some of this information is going to help you make good decisions because you have really a granular understanding about their workflow. The next thing to understand is that humans don't have a primary key. Like, we have this idea that everybody has a singular identity and they should use it across the organization. And that's great. But when you, again, you're entering things into this source of information that flows downstream, in lots of cases, like, how do you know one person is the same person across their entire employment schedule? So like, maybe you have a full-time employee who leaves and then they get married while they're gone and have changed their last name and they come back. And they want the same access to everything. They've been rehired into the same role. But we don't really have any way of knowing that it's the same person. And so they want to know why they don't have the same email address, or they might like wonder why they have two separate identities and there's like a closed identity from their previous employment in a bunch of systems. And so then you get these errors that say that, you know, like this person's account already exists. There's no, like, this is where I say humans don't have a primary key. And this quote actually comes from a talk that I went to years ago that I cannot find a reference to, so I can't credit this person. But we don't have a singular identifier to say we're the same person throughout all of the systems. So we have all these proxies for it. But we know social security numbers shouldn't be used to identify people in employment systems at all. Not everybody has one. They get stolen, et cetera. Names don't really work because people's names change frequently. So you have to be on the alert for people having duplicate identities, for them to be overlapping across your different systems. And this is really something that is important to pay attention to. And that's because changes that impact employee identity and that impact access happen all the time. And knowing what those are and being able to react to them appropriately will drive a lot of your analysis around determining like what employees should have access to, how you get information about when those changes happen that you need to respond to, and how you can sort of automate them or anticipate them in advance. I made a list here because some of them are a little bit unexpected, but you have things like role changes, simple things like people change departments, somebody gets promoted and becomes a manager. Name changes are another obvious one. Somebody's last name changes. They change their first name. They no longer have a last name. You know, this can happen in a variety of unpredictable ways. You might have attribute changes. Somebody might move to another country or another state. They might move to another department or another cost center in the organization. They might move to a new country and have a different currency. You know, all of these different changes will trickle down through all of your associated systems. Another important one is employee classification. So full-time employees might have different permissions than part-time employees that are much different from contractors, and you may even have vendors that need access occasionally. So these are all things to take under consideration. And the last one, and probably the one that we think about the most, is employee status. So is your employee being onboarded, but hasn't started yet. So they have some accounts are open, but not connected or whatever. You might have an employee that's on leave and your policies might say that employees can't have access to email while they're on official leave, or maybe they do, or there's some exception case. You might have something called garden leave where people don't have access to things, but they're still technically employed by the organization. People can get terminated, people are rehired. All of these changes in employee status are things that you will need to respond to and handle in your automated systems. From an IT perspective, there are also a lot of challenges. So one of the biggest ones is legacy systems that are not connected to SSO, don't accept SAML, have like some kind of username and password that's, I don't know, like best case scenario stored in one password and you rotate it every time people change. So like that's very difficult to automate, particularly if the system just has no ability to integrate with everything else. One of the other challenges is knowing who owns different systems. So if you say have something that you want, like access needs to be approved, well, who approves access to that? Who's in charge, like who is the gatekeeper for this particular application or service? That means that you have to know who owns it. And people don't want to take responsibility for approving access to things, even if they absolutely have to. So one of the challenges in implementing this system is actually defining what a service is and determining who owns it, and making sure that they understand that they're responsible for access, for managing access to that. Another one is vendor relationships and integrations. This is often owned by IT, but not always. And kind of related to that is a shadow IT, what we call shadow IT. Sometimes people don't like the tools that the organization has contracted with and start using something else. And they just kind of create logins for their team and kind of quietly use it on the side. But that means that you have, you know, employee information and company information and assets in a system that is outside the IT organization that identity isn't managed in and isn't known about. So making sure that you have the kind of relationship with your employees so that you don't have that happening is important. Remote work is another challenge with this. People need access to things quickly or they're completely unable to do their job. If you're not in an office, you can't really go over to the IT department and have them help you log in. You know, you are logged out of everything or whatever, and you have to prove that you are who you are. Sometimes asking for help as a remote employee feels like you're social engineering your own department. But that's one of the challenges that needs to be dealt with in from a policy perspective. Like IT needs to know what to do, but employees also need to know how to request help in a way that doesn't feel weird and suspicious. And just keeping track of all of your systems. Like to the extent that you can, automating service discovery, like not having to go through and maintain manual lists of what all of your systems are is absolutely important, especially as you grow. Like things just, you lose track of things. So one of the ways that you can solve this too is by restricting access. You can, if you have sophisticated enough identity systems, you can make access location bound. So only people who are physically located in this office are allowed to access this set of resources. You might have it be time bound. Somebody can only access something for the next hour, the next 24 hours. You can divide up your data into subsets. This set of employees has access, this set of employees has access to customer information, but no other set of employees does. You can make access view only. So this is really common with databases. Make sure that people aren't able to change or modify any of that information. They can only view it. You can restrict it by environment, divide things into staging or production. And you can limit transmission of data. Don't allow it to be downloaded to employees' laptops or transferred to other systems. These are some of the ways that you can build your systems or buy vendors that handle these kinds of things for you. And that's really important because you are going to get requests for things that you really don't want to say yes to. People need access to stuff that falls outside of your very carefully crafted systems all the time, which means that they need to be flexible, even as they're logical and well-documented and compliant. So we try to come up with ways to be flexible within the bounds of our company's needs. So some of the tools and strategies, I've talked a little bit about this, automate all the things, automate your system discovery, automate your system ownership, keep analytics, build systems that detect unusual behavior and alert or manage it, automate device management and your provisioning and deprovisioning. You can use vendor solutions or you can roll your own. To the extent that you can eliminate legacy systems, they're just a giant black hole. And human solutions are part of it too. It's not just all software. Make friends with HR, understand your employee information and data, where it comes from and what the employee lifecycle looks like, have a good relationship with IT and be empathetic for the challenges they have in implementing all of these beautiful rules that the security team came up with. At the end of the day, somebody has to be awake and click on a thing sometimes. So the more that we can spare people having to do that task, the better off the organization is from a security and from a human perspective. And if you really can't automate all of the things, then write the run books, maintain the run books, care about yourself and the next person who has to do these tasks. So this is the fun part, hopefully. So how do you test for unpredictable scenarios? One of my current team's favorite ways of preparing for the future is to do sorts of game day exercises or tabletop scenarios where we get together and walk through a scenario. Tabletop exercises are usually pretty informal discussions. You'll just get together, you'll have a problem, an example problem, and then you'll walk through like what would happen, like which alerts would go off, what people would be involved, how would they know about the problem, and then make sure that our systems would respond to it in an appropriate way. Beyond just having an informal discussion, you can also do a simulation where you ask people to sort of demonstrate what they would do given the scenario, and everybody can watch and judge them. But the goal of these is to test and validate your policies, your systems, and your procedures. You don't need very much to do it. You just need an idea and some people. A facilitator is helpful, or a note taker who can kind of guide the whole thing and isn't a participant. You need a scenario, and then you need the people who'd be involved in this incident. So some examples that you can use for identity governance and administration in particular. This is a set of problems that I came up with. Feel free to create your own or use these at your organization if you want to. This is just getting so in an IGA tabletop scenario, we get IT, maybe HR, ops, and legal or finance, depending on the problem, and get them together in a room and present them with one of these scenarios and ask them if their systems would handle it. So one of my favorite examples actually is a personal identity change. So an employee maybe changed their first name and their gender, and it's implemented in Workday as like a preferred name change, and it flows through the systems, but some of them keep flickering on and off. And the person's email address is an alias, but it didn't fully change. So looking at the symptoms of this problem and then tracing, so in a tabletop scenario, you'd try to identify all of the places where this information is incorrect. And then you need to understand, how did you know that that information was incorrect? Is it because the employee told you? Is it because you noticed it? Is it because they didn't have access to something because there was a mismatch in information? Any number of things could go wrong. And why is this particular, why do I mention this as a security problem? So one of the things that I didn't mention that I think is really important about maintaining employee identity is that in addition to needing to have these things be consistent across systems so that you can automate them, it's also really important to build trust between your IT department and your security department and the individuals who are employed at a company who use these services. And if somebody's name is incorrect in a system, then an IT is dismissive of it or doesn't understand how to fix it or doesn't take it seriously, you erode that trust. And it's really critical, particularly in a remote world, that employees feel like their identity is well-defined, consistent across the organization, and secure and private to the extent that it needs to be. So this is a scenario that you should consider whether your systems accommodate it well. Some other probably more standard ones that I also think are really important is a failed offboard. So a long-term employee in your infrastructure department leaves the organization. And now, you need to check to make sure that they don't still have access to a bunch of important things, and that shutting their account off didn't then shut down a bunch of stuff across the organization. If you really want to go lean into the enacting this, you can just cut the access for one of your long-term employees and just see what happens, and make sure that one of the biggest problems is sometimes with organizations that grow and have long-term employees is that you'll have like all of these important systems that are set up on some person who doesn't work there anyore's credit card or something like, or their email address that is no longer works, and finding those things, like, you don't want to find that when something is wrong. You want to identify it in advance and make sure that you make your systems resilient and responsive to this. So I really wanted to walk through one of these with people, but the Hopin platform is kind of awkward and I'm not sure how we would do it. So you're going to have to just live with me giving you some examples. But when you're conducting a tabletop exercise, like I said, it's pretty informal, but there's kind of a standard set of questions that you would want to ask. The first is, what are the symptoms? What systems exhibited this problem? How did we know? Would our automated tools have surfaced the problem? If there is alerting built in, did the alerts go to the right person? Was it the right level of alerts? Like, hopefully nobody got paged. Maybe somebody needed to get paged and they didn't. Testing that detection out, and the path that information travels, and communication systems is an important part of this. Do you know what the impact is? Is this an incident? If you have an incident response protocol and something went wrong with an offboard, is that defined as an incident? Do you need to activate incident response protocols? Is this a situation where you need to use disaster recovery? Is there a financial impact? Was there a data breach? Who needs to know about it if it happened? Can you calculate the dollar amount of this problem? That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. And then how do you better handle it? So how does our current process handle this? What was it missing? Can we improve detection? Can we resolve it automatically? Are the right people in this room to discuss it? Like, if you're going through a tabletop scenario and you realize that you don't have any information about something in particular, then maybe you don't have the right team put together to address it, and that's really good information moving forward. So to recap, identity is really hard. It's a difficult problem. It's not consistent. Your systems and your people are going to, be unpredictable. And you can't possibly capture every scenario when you try to automate these systems. But understanding all of the ways that it can go wrong and building relationships and trust between different parts of your organization allow you to be flexible and responsive to people's needs. You should automate everything that you can, recognize that that's not always possible, and develop human systems to work around it. And again, build trust between your teams, between your security organization and the people who use it, who are your customers, not your literal customers who pay you money, but your customers who are the employees. And thank you for your time. I am going to take this moment to say that Stitch Fix is hiring. Our security team is looking for a lead infrastructure engineer and a lead software engineer. I'm more than happy to answer questions about what it's like to work at Stitch Fix or on these teams. And then my team on platforms is hiring a principal infrastructure engineer, and I'm sure I would love to work with you. Thanks, and if you have any questions, there's just a few minutes left and you can drop them in the chat or contact me outside. I'll share this presentation as well. Somebody asked, how do you handle a user who wants the flexibility to change the defined role because they want to have a job rotation intern and they learn a little of this and a little of that, so they have a combination of roles, but they don't actually want the manager to do or change things? Yeah, that's a really good example of how complicated this can be. Like I said, I'll go back to the slide that I gave at one point. Now I don't remember where it is. That included, this one. Don't touch my garbage. That included this. So think about, how long is the intern going to be there? Can you limit access based on time? Can you limit the subset of data? So even if you give them access to some systems, maybe they only have access to parts of it that don't have PII or aren't subject to GDPR regulations. I'm just kind of spitballing here. Maybe you can make sure that it's view only. You can limit their environment. That's the best thing I can recommend. So like I said, this is sort of an example of where like RBAC just kind of fails because you don't really have roles that capture all of the needs somebody has in an organization. And that's where you need to start getting creative by making sure that your systems are built to be really flexible and don't rely just on a set of basic information about people. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. And my contact information is at the beginning of this slide, so feel free to reach out to me if you want to rant about how hard this problem is at your organization. And thank you, Patricia, for joining. Actually, she's a former colleague who knows some of these problems really well and taught me probably like half of this presentation. So thanks for coming and for helping.